Hi everybody, uh, my name is Mike Jackson and I'd like to welcome everybody who's associated, involved in this World Organization of Systems and Cybernetics event. I'd like to talk to you for a few minutes about critical systems thinking. I've always regarded critical systems thinking as a second order endeavour in that it looks at the philosophical and theoretical assumptions underpinning different systems approaches and different systems methodologies. And that's really important because only by doing that can you really understand how they differ or why they differ. You can understand how you might be able to improve them. You can understand the different strengths and weaknesses. And you can begin to think about how to use them in combination. So I'll try and give you a background to critical systems thinking and what it's about in three stages. First, I'll just say something about complex adaptive systems. Then I'll talk about how we can perhaps learn something about complex adaptive systems. And finally, look at how we might, using systems thinking, seek to do something about the problems that complex adaptive systems pose or improve complex adaptive systems. First of all, then, I just need to make clear how I think about complex adaptive systems. They're often said these days to have VUCA characteristics of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And that's fine as long as we also take into account the cognitive aspects of complexity, which are perhaps a little bit implicit in that VUCA definition. So if we take the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'm thinking particularly of how it evolved in the UK, then obviously there was systems aspects to it. We were missing some vital parts and logistical means to deal with the pandemic, staffing some of the equipment necessary. We didn't have the track and trace processes in place. There are issues of how centralized the system was and how whether it'd been better if it had been decentralized to deal with the way the pandemic took hold and evolved, and of course issues of inequality as well. Certain groups hit much harder than others by the pandemic. But there's also all the cognitive aspects, the way people reacted to the pandemic. The scientists basing their work on epidemiological models, government reacting to those models and putting policies in place, reacting of course as well to the political situation in which they found themselves. The public reacting to the government and its policies. All these things had a bearing upon how the pandemic developed. So how do we approach a complex adaptive system defined in those terms as having both systemic and cognitive aspects very significant in the way it develops? According to Edgar Morin, you can react in two ways. You can treat it as a case of restricted complexity. You can seek to model it, look for underlying causes which you can understand and which thereby give you a better handle, enabling you to predict its course and control it better. But that to him remains within the epistemology of the natural sciences. It's the way perhaps system dynamics might react. attempting to understand the feedback, feed-forward loops, the interactions between those, and to understand the course of the pandemic using that kind of modelling, or agent-based modelling might react. But according to Moran, that's exactly the wrong way to proceed with a complex adaptive system of that nature. You have to accept and treat it as a case of general complexity and take seriously those cognitive, epistemological aspects of it, paradigmatic aspects of it as well, the way that people are thinking about it and reacting to it. And that makes it, if you try and take all those things into account, makes it incomprehensible to us. It can't be grasped using any one model or any one systems approach. You can't understand it in its totality. You can only produce partial accounts of it, partial truths, which will in some way guide you in terms of understanding it and in terms of seeking to intervene. In system thinking, of course, we've long understood the nature of complex adaptive systems. Akoff called them messes, and Rittel and Weber saw that they gave rise to wicked problems, which had systemic aspects, difficult to understand the causal relationships involved, possible to understand the causal relationships involved, and they had the cognitive aspects of different publics. They described them as a multiplicity of publics, a pluralism of publics, viewing them in different ways, evaluating actions taken in different ways, and the results of those actions, evaluating those in different ways as well. So we've understood the incomprehensibility of complex adaptive systems for a while. So how has systems thinking, in particular critical systems thinking, reacted to the incomprehensibility of general complexity? It's not easy, and sometimes I think of it being like theologians of different religions trying to understand the incomprehensible, the absolute, to try and represent God, and they resort to a whole variety of different metaphors, which are different from one religion to another, in their attempts to understand the absolute. And the process is largely unsuccessful because, as far as I'm aware, God has given no indication. She's given no indication yet of what metaphors, therefore what religions she prefers, and therefore supported one religion against another. It doesn't seem to be the case that that's occurred. But we're not quite in that situation with systems thinking, because in the natural world and that we exist in, and the social world which we are involved in and which we're involved in creating as well, has shown, they have shown some preference for particular ways of understanding. In that particular ways of understanding, particular root metaphors or particular paradigms have gained acceptance and helped human beings over time to get some kind of handle on the world in which they exist. If we look at philosophy, for example, and Pepper's book on world hypotheses, he comes up with 4 root metaphors, which he sees as very creative constructions of generations of human beings that have served us well over time. Root metaphors of mechanism, organicism, formism, and contextualism. You can see that there are particular sociological paradigms which has served us over time, which has stood the test of time and seem to give us knowledge, enabling us to make our way reasonably successfully in the social and cultural world in which we play out our lives. So we're not without feedback from the physical and the cultural realities in which we exist. Certain root metaphors, certain sociological paradigms have acted as what Lakoff and Johnson called experiential gestalts, guiding us in ways which have enabled us to be more or less successful, at least to survive well enough in the physical and social worlds. And without those, we'd be pretty lost. So my research on these root metaphors and sociological paradigms that have proven useful to the human species, I come up with five what I call systemic perspectives, which have given us guidance, act as experiential gestalts, creative constructions of human beings, from which you can start using all five of them to gain some way of getting to grips with complex adaptive systems. And those are, for me, the machine perspective, the organismic perspective, the cultural and political perspective, the societal environmental perspective, and the interrelationships perspective. So if you approach complex adaptive systems not trying to treat them as cases of restricted complexity, model them as totalities and understand their underlying features, but treat them as cases of general complexity, approach them with what you know are partial understandings based upon these different systemic perspectives, then I think you can start to make progress and learn your way about some of their characteristics and how you might go about actually intervening in them. So finally, given that we can only gain partial understandings through different systemic perspectives of general complexity, how should critical system thinkers seek to try and intervene to improve the way we'd like complex adaptive systems to behave? Well, it's going to be useful, obviously, to have different systems approaches, different systems methodologies corresponding to the partial understandings that are proven to be useful experiential gestalts that have helped guide the human species in its way in the natural world and in the social and cultural domain. And we're fortunate indeed to have systems approaches and systems methodologies which have developed and can guide us to intervene in ways which correspond to those partial systemic perspectives that we briefly talked about. So if we look through the machine systemic perspective and we see issues arising in complex adaptive systems through that perspective, we have ways of treating them. We have means of improving them from that point of view. We can improve efficiency and we can improve efficacy using systems methodologies such as systems engineering and lean systems approaches. Of course, we know that's only going to be a partial improvement, if an improvement at all. We have to use other systems approaches corresponding to other partial understandings. We perhaps need to view it also, the complex adaptive system, as an organism evolving in relation to its environment, adapting in relation to its environment? Are the parts functioning to enable it to work well in relation to its environment? This brings issues of viability, of sustainability, of anti-fragility to the fore. And again, we have systems, methodologies, approaches, models, which can enable us, give us a handle on those sorts of issues, such as the viable system model and socio-technical systems thinking. Another systemic perspective which has proven useful over time is the cultural political perspective, derived from Pepper's contextualism. Here we're concerned with effectiveness, whether we're doing the right things, with mutual understanding, with trying to deal with conflict. And we're aware that we have soft systems approaches which have developed specifically for that purpose. We have through critical systems thinking a second order understanding of their strengths and of their weaknesses, and we know that soft systems approaches are appropriate for that kind of concern, bringing about mutual understanding, accommodation, shared meaning, seeking to deal with conflict, to challenge groupthink, all of which are going to be useful in certain circumstances of complex adaptive systems. There are more radical sociological paradigms which have given us knowledge, useful knowledge in seeking to improve society, and I take to capture them within the societal environmental systemic perspective. What stakeholders are being advantaged and which disadvantaged by a particular systems intervention. Are we taking the environment into account? Are we taking future generations into account? Are we adding to inequality or seeking to do something about inequality, benefiting those who are the most disadvantaged? And we have systems approaches that can point and guide us to how we're doing in terms of involving and benefiting and improving the lot of groups which are not involved necessarily in the decision making and who are potentially disadvantaged by it. And the interrelationships perspective as well guides us to look at the interrelationship between the issues that the other perspectives might throw up. In complex adaptive systems, we're never likely to gain a full understanding of those interrelationships. They're incomprehensible. They're far too difficult to map and to chart and to model. But they may give us some sort of guidance, some sort of pointers to where we might look. So, critical systems practice, the practice of using critical systems ideas, is to learn through the process of using different systems approaches which work, and you'll only learn which work by trying them out, but also by looking at the results through other systems perspectives to ensure that you're in fact taking a very rounded approach to what's working and what might not be working, whether you're in fact making things worse in different points of view, from different points of view, and using the approaches in combination to get some kind of rounded approach to improvement, and evaluating the results in that rounded approach, in that rounded way as well. Have we made it better as a machine, an organism, a cultural, political perspective, a societal, from the environmental, societal environmental perspective? So critical systems thinking has a particular view on complex adaptive systems. It treats them as a case of general complexity, incomprehensible. You cannot gain one understanding of them, but we're not totally lost. We have a knowledge of certain partial understandings, partial truths, different systemic perspectives which have guided human beings in their dealings with the natural and social world over time. And in seeking to do even better and to deal with the VUCA characteristics and the cognitive characteristics of general complexity. We have a range of systems methodologies, systems approaches corresponding to those different systems perspectives, which we can try out, and by using in combination give us the best chance of bringing about some sort of general improvement. So thank you for listening. There'll be lots of other viewpoints put forward in these sessions of the World Organization of Systems and Cybernetics, and I hope I've contributed to the thinking that we will be, and the work that we'll be undertaking over these sessions. Thank you from me, Mike Jackson.